morning, good morning. My name is Barbora Příhodová. I'm the curator of PQ Talks, and I want to all welcome you here in our lovely space. It's actually quite lovely this morning. We have some air, which haven't always been the case. It's day 4 of PQ Talks. Somebody mentioned to me it's Sunday. I was surprised, kind of. I've been here for a while, and I don't even know what the day is. So I was thinking, talking about scenography on Sunday morning, how crazy. But we all love it, right? So thank you for coming and being here. Today, the first 3 panels all are somewhat about reconsidering scenography, reconsidering the norms, the conventions that we have. The first panel is a composite panel, which means that those were individual proposals, individual presentations that came in, and we put them together because they all look at contemporary scenographic practices and propose new ways we can think about them, perhaps. We have 4 speakers. They're gonna take the stage one by one. They have about 15 minutes, each of them, to speak, and then we're going to have some discussion and open for questions. So first, let me welcome on stage Clémentine Cluzeaud.
Good morning to you all. I would like to thank the Quadrennial team. And as you can hear, I'm French. In Beyond Scenography, Rachel Hann reminds us that Greek skene is an act of orientation of a place. To me, scenography is an act of redefining a horizon line. It's also an experience of deviation, a gaze from other perspectives. I studied this act of reorientation in the context of specific works, the destruction of a set without explanation in Miet Varlop's Mystery Magnet, the expansion of a wooden hut without support in the works of the Chapuisat brothers, the reenactment of a football match with a single player without a ball in Massimo Furlan's works, the vision of a sunrise or a sunset on a rooftop in Joan Layton's participatory choreography, The Vigil, and the combinations and arrangements of a body, that of dancer Kaori Ito, and a space in Aurélien Bory's performance Plexus. These works, whose aesthetics are very different, both in their relation to the audience and in the way they are set, are linked together by the importance they give to scenography. Each of one of these performances is built on an attempt to exhaust either materials, either body, or the possibilities of combinations of materials on stage. This attempt, which is close to Beckett's quad, creates a new language in the performance. It invites the audience to a new state of attention, whether euphoric with Furlan or meditative with Layton. What appeals to me in these works is the fact that they are performed without any explanation. In these works, the situation is these works are explorations of present scenographic conditions without any attempt to justify them. To me, scenography has the ability to make us perceive reality as it is. All these examples can be an illustration of Clément Rosset's thinking. For this philosopher, the real is idiotic. You don't have to find any meaning in reality. In order to protect ourselves from the fact that reality is meaningful, we invent what he calls doubles. The work of art, to Rosset, is both what shows us that reality has no significance and is at the same time formally very rigorous, but showing us that side of reality is not disappointed. It is deeply rooted in joy. Clément Rosset encourages us to shift our focus in order to get a better glimpse of reality. This can only be perceived from a specific angle. It's interesting for scenography. It's not just a metaphor. So this is why I want to show you a few works of French contemporary scenography that I think illustrate this approach of an unfocused gaze from a specific angle. In the first place, I analyzed this decentering gaze from an aesthetic point of view, but it seems to me that it is also a way to take the world in account. There are three areas of thinking that I relate to this experience of decentering gaze. First of all, scenographers are more and more interested by the agentivity of materials. In the second place, new proposals to organize spectator assemblies emerge. Finally, the reuse of scenographic material is also becoming a dramaturgical issue. Most of the It was while reading an article by Mireille Loscolena about stage director and scenographer Pierre Meunier that I became interested in Clément Rosset's thinking. She described his work, I quote, as idiotic contemplation, having the ability to create the construction of contemplation for the audience. La Belle Meunière, company directed by Pierre Meunier and Marguerite Borda, focuses on a pebble in Au milieu du désordre, in the middle of the mess, on mud, in Rien de grave, nothing serious, a very slippery choreography. This approach, which could be described as material performance, echoes to neo-materialist thinking, but also to anthropologists and philosophers, thinking which, without directly subscribing to this theory, propose a way of thinking which offers a bigger place to non-humans and materials. It is no longer a question of illustrating or duplicating reality, but of exploring the condition of a material and the relationships woven around it. One of La Belle Meunière's proposals shows the desire to question the object. In Buffet à vif, smashed to pieces, a kitchen buffet is scrutinized and then joyously destructed by the dancer Raphaël Cotin and Pierre Meunier. Here, the domestic object, which seemed to us to be an accessory deprived of playfulness, becomes the material of a performance of destructive sculpture. Once the sideboard has been destroyed, Marguerite Borda creates an installation from its ruins. For the company, this flattening out of the piece of furniture creates, I quote, a possible continuity, a form of abstraction. The audience can then come on stage to change their point of view and take with them the remains of the buffet. This desire not to leave the audience in the magic of the performance, a double of the real, as Rosset might say, was also the goal of Aurélien Bory. During the show Plexus, it was impossible for the audience to understand the way the scenography was constructed. But at the end, he invited the audience to come on stage and he explained the set design, thousands of black ropes hanging from a ceiling. In these proposals, scenography is a practice that sets up the conditions for a side look on an object that we had not seen, a material that was previously used only for construction. The object conceals nothing else than itself, but it opens the door to daydreams in a jubilant exploration in which the audience is freed from illusion. This way of capturing the world from an oblique, this anthropocentric angle leads to some specific scenographic proposals. For instance, changes of scale, whether in terms of miniaturizations of the set design or, on the other side, immersive proposals. Immersion is a miniaturization of humans. This immersion is coupled with a very strong attraction to landscapes. Ah, yes, it's. For example, the Safi collective from Marseille explores the natural resources of wasteland. In J'ai mangé la rivière, I ate the river, they designed a collection of ice creams inspired by the landscapes of the river Juine. Their work seems to me to be an exciting challenge to the segmentation of the disciplinary fields of scenography in France. This may involve showing natural or physical phenomena. This is how You Will Disappear, a performance by Gisèle Vienne, explores, with the work of Fujiko Nakaya, atmospheric creations. La Transhumante, by Joanne Le Guilherme, takes in account the structural forces of matter. In this site-specific performance, technicians built and dismantled a long self-supporting wooden structure that crosses the city. It can also question the desire to reflect fragile balances, as in La Construction, the construction, by the Tricycle Doll Company. This company has built its own mobile theater open to the landscape. This creation are a reflection of porosity between the scenographer's studio and the stage. Nathalie Gérard has proposed the term studio writers to describe these scenographers artists who play with the merging of both spaces. The studio must be in constant relationship with the stage, always open to the continual transformation of the material. This urge is so powerful that it leads some artists to redefine their practice. In an article written by Quentin Rual and Vincent Beaubois, Anne-Sophie Turion, director and scenographer, says site-specific work offers greater autonomy for her. So she works directly with materials, both technical and dramaturgical, that she finds on the spot where she is. The reuse of scenographic material is not just an ethical issue, it is a whole part of the dramaturgy of this scenographic creation. La Belle Meunière and Camille Boitel's productions use the fragility of found objects in their performances. Questions linked to the world of the workshop cross the stage. Bordel, Mess, by Jeanne Moineau and Anne-Sophie Turion, ask the question how to storage the scenographies of their common past works. They have fun unpacking material that clutters up the scenographer's life and flat. Sometimes, a set design is lent to others, like a sample in music. Sylvain Creusevaux, in his performance Angelus Novus Antifaust, uses the sets from the company Le Théâtre du Radeau, but his set designer, Jean-Baptiste Belon, reinterprets them. Aurélien Bory experimented with this scenographic transfer for Je me souviens, le ciel est loin, la terre aussi, I remember, the sky is far and so is earth, by reusing the set and costume elements from a performance directed by Mladen Materić in 1994. Proposals to reuse the set design augur a renewed vision of the autocratic nature of copyright in favor of greater movement and collaboration. Scenography becomes an event and no longer a univocal proposal for an image of the world. It's an example of a side look that reinvents a set design. This proposition finds another echo when the works are part of a constellation of proposals based on the same forms. This is the case with Philippe Ken's La Nuit des Taupes, The Night of the Moles, La Parade des Taupes, The Parade of the Moles, and L'Après-midi des Taupes, The Afternoon of the Moles, and obviously Théo Mercier's proteiform work, Outremonde, which is an installation of sand sculptures and also a performative work. New relationships are performed, new assemblies are constituted. These works show us there is a multiplicity of perspectives with the same forms. So focus on the elements like landscapes or materials that were not usually center-staged, objects and materials chosen for their agentivity, forms of the scenographic devices, processes being explained, workshop experiences repeated, multiplicity of viewpoints, scenographic transfers, proteoform works, scenographers on stage. These are just some of the points of decentering offered by contemporary scenography. In this respect, and it will be the end of my presentation, I find the concept of ecophany invented by scenographer Anna Belvergne and scenography researcher Quentin Rioual interesting. Ecophany interweaves a reflection on material positions, recycling, reuse, transport, societal position, working condition, creative processes, and dramaturgies, seeking to analyze the various ways in which ecological appearances are made. I find the term interesting in the fact that it brings together the diversity of my examples. Pierre Meunier said, I create the condition for the discovery of matter. What I'm trying to do is wake myself up from the banality or indifference we feel towards matter. These scenographies allow the defamiliarization necessary for the emergence of this idiotic, astonished gaze, which is the first step to political, ecological, and societal questioning that we need to have. Thank you for listening.
Time, so we appreciate it. Thank you. So next up is Rachel Hann. Thank you, Rachel.
Or if we just go back. Okay, so thank you very much for that, Clémentine. And there's lots there that actually I'm going to kind of build upon now, particularly in terms of thinking about the orientating effects of scenographic practice. But I want to start with a definition of culture by a cultural geographer called Ben Anderson. And he's written a series of essays kind of exploring different ideas of cultural geography and how it emerged in the 1990s. And performance and the performative is actually a core aspect of that project. So there's lots of geographers meeting and talking about things that I would describe as scenographic, but yet they don't use that language and they don't reference this canon of work that we represent. So I'm very interested in taking seriously how we might join cultural geography with scenography through the provocation of cultural scenography. So I start with Donna Haraway's provocation in her book, Staying with the Trouble, where it matters what worlds. So there's a number of different English kind of language things that happen in this presentation, but I'm particularly interested in the second world. So the way in which world becomes a verb, a doing, a thing done. Rather than a container or a resource for humanity, we imagine world not as something which is out there, but something that is a process and processes. And that what we call human as a category is another collection of processes. So in terms of thinking about Ben Anderson's definition of culture as mediated experience, he also offers forms of life and assembled affect. But particularly in terms of mediated experience, he offers the provocation of not only thinking of culture in the culture-nature divide, where culture is humanity's process and nature is a separate process, but thinking about how mediated experiences might afford us greater insight into our symbiosis with all these other processes, which we might currently describe as non-human. So some of my key questions that I'm currently asking myself, and this might be useful for the question and answers afterwards, is scenography a speculative device for investigating world feelings? There's a particular cultural geographer called Derek McCormack who proposes the idea of a balloon as a speculative device, and then thinks about the different ways in which you can explore world processes through balloons. Going up in balloons, physically in a balloon, letting off balloons, imagining the whole world as a balloon. It's quite a wonderful little experiment. And then the other one is, are scenographics kind of equivalent to or approximate to atmospherics? And what is the political task of scenography if scenographics are atmospherics at some level? And does scenographics offer a methodology for practicing world differently? So this is based upon the Colombian-American anthropologist's work, Arturo Escobar, and his work around ideas of the political possible, which he wraps up in the concept of the pluriversal, which I won't go into in too much depth today. But the main point of it is that what counts as possible, both in political terms and social terms, is often mediated by an idea of the cosmos, or an idea of world, that is often underwritten. So the idea that there is only one world, what he describes as the one world narrative, is a narrative owned by the colonial West. And arguing that actually the colonial West's definition of world as resource, world as discovery, world as something which is out there for humans to co-opt for their own means, he argues that is one way of thinking about world, but it is not the only way. And we might adopt a pluriversal approach to the possible, whereby there are multiple possibles. So the most concrete example I will give of this is someone you might have heard of called Elon Musk. And his kind of project, he's not the only one, that actually the deep future of humanity is out in space. So we need to go colonize other planets in order for human thriving to continue. We are such a delicate species that we need to continually be expanding our own footprints in order to thrive and succeed on the grounds in which we define ourselves in terms of modernity. And what's interesting, and I'm interested in the mediated affects of this, and the way in which particularly science fiction has reinforced that narrative as being somehow possible. And we even see this within political discussions, that as a deep future of humanity. I use this with my students often and say, what's more possible, the end of capitalism or moving to Mars? And they're like, well, yeah, moving to Mars, probably. That sounds like more capitalism, basically. So that kind of notion of what is possible in the political terms is exactly what Arturo Escobar is interested in. So in terms of a brief summary of the Beyond Scenography project, the legacy question of it was, what does scenography do? How does it affect, orientate, and shape staged atmospheres? And within this, Clémentine already kind of approached this, kind of look at revisiting a Greek translation in English in particular of skene, and looking at it not so much in terms of writing, which in English in particular means both the kind of act of writing, but also the logocentric systems that we produce as writing. And that isn't necessarily the case within the Greek translation. I actually owe Sophia Pantavaki as kind of putting me onto this in the initial case. But graphos as an act, as an etching, as a scribing. So skene also means tent in ancient Greek. So we might see actually scenography as a scribing of tents. But they might be tents made of sound, of light, or feeling. They're not exclusively made only of material. We can also see how that starts to blend out into the atmospheric qualities that a lot of cultural geographers were interested in. They've also done a lot on looking at atmospheres and how artworks can create and manufacture atmospheres for study, so you can understand what an atmosphere is. So what can stages do? What can scenes do? What comes first, stage or scene? I actually say that both of those things coexist together. And I make this kind of argument, there are no stages without scenographics. So all stages are known through their orientations, which I claim in terms of scenographics. So rather than scenography as scenography as a crafting, which is put onto a stage, the idea and practice and experience of stage is already scenographic in that context. As designers, we already know that any space can become scenographic, but I'm particularly interested in the ways in which we can claim that as the territory of a theoretical project of scenographics. So very briefly, these are some of the words that I mentioned, which I'm not going to go into detail, but the key difference is that this half is more about crafting, And this half is more about orientating. So how we become orientated to world, to place, to society, to political cultures. And then this one is about the particular acts that we might undertake to craft those mediated experiences. One particular example I really like to give is Paul Sermon's 1993 Telematic Dreaming, where we can see a mediated experience here, which I would see as a physical reenactment of what internet feels like, of being close and connected, but also separated at the same time. It has a beautiful moment where obviously there's another person and another. Back then they didn't have the same level of kind of using chroma key, and they've been projected back into this space, and they can reach over and they can touch each other, but still being separated. So that becomes a feeling of the internet in that regard. And then these are a number of different words. But so Derek McCormack offers this provocation in one of his essays on post-phenomenological life cycles, where he says, a stage or a set is a machine for producing the aesthetic scenographic affects of world. And what is more, those who witness the production of those effects often know it. They are not dupes. So this is in particular relation to a critique offered by an ecological theorist called Timothy Morton, whereby he argues that the idea of world is no longer useful, and that we should actually kind of ditch the idea of world and think about this idea of mesh, because mesh better represents the idea of process. But what McCormack says is that actually we can still talk about the narratives and the mediated experiences of world, which Morton describes as mere lighting and sound effects. Like, that's the kind of language that they use, kind of almost dismissing it in that regard. But I'm very interested in that lighting and sound effects and the ways in which we might study that as a means of production. So actually, if we could play the video at this point. So this is the opening sequence from an Amazon-produced TV series called Doom Patrol. Doom Patrol was a series produced by the comic conglomerate DC Comics. And this is the opening sequence of episode 8, where we see the introduction of a character called Danny the Street. And Danny the Street is a sentient life form, which is utterly non-human, and it offers a place, a home, a base for those who are part of the Doom Patrol to offer refuge from the apocalypse that's happening around them.
Agent Wilson, the second we get your signal, we're coming in hot. You got your ticket to the freak show?
Yeah. Good to go.
Don't catch anything. You got this, Morris. Let's tear it up.
So I'm particularly interested in the way in which Danny the Street can also change form, can reorientate itself in many different ways. It's also described as the first non-binary character in the DC universe, in so much that they identify with a number of different genders. And what particularly drew me to it was the way in which it uses kind of the wind, the air. So Danny can control all of the atmospherics, all of the things that make world a process. Danny can control the temperature. All these people are people who seek refuge within Danny, and Danny looks after them and cares for them. Danny is a character. The first comic was published in 1990, and it's based on a drag queen called Danny LaRue. And that's where the name comes from. And this playing with gender is a distinct aspect of Danny the Street, but also whereby that playing with gender actually becomes something that's, from Danny's point of view, it's just a playful part of the way in which you might communicate and experience different forms of world, rather than it being something which is predicated on a set system of binary. So we can go back to the slides now. So this is how it first emerges in the comic book, sort of actually going into this perceptual cabaret. So inside Danny, there's always a theatre. And the theatre is a place where Danny gets to experiment with loads of different speculative ways of being. And in particular, the people that come in to live with Danny and thrive, it allows Danny to allow them to explore their imaginations and for them to be their fully rounded self. So that character that you just saw from the TV show, they come in then and they're kind of working for this government organisation. And then later on, you discover that person re-identified as a kind of drag performer, but also discovered their own homosexual identity within that context, and Danny allowed them to free themselves from the kind of social political constraints of what is possible in their lives. And then you can see different kind of iterations of how those kind of sign writings initially emerged. Danny also has the capacity, as I said, to change shape. So at one point, Danny is a brick. At one point, Danny is an island, Danny the island, and at one point, Danny becomes Danny the world, where Danny kind of reconceptualizes themselves in another universe because of the apocalypse that's happening as part of the Doom Patrol series. It then offers the capacity for these characters to literally escape to another world, and Danny affords that as a mechanism in the story. So this idea of atmospherics and scenographics, I'm particularly interested in atmospherics as being both highly emotional, but also highly physical, about this blurring between a binary concept of subject and object, and how we might see scenographics as in some way helping us test out those interrelationships. Because atmospheric, certainly in English, or atmosphere, is a very familiar concept. We can talk about the atmosphere of this space, but actually what are we talking about? It's something that's highly ephemeral, but yet also quite concrete and quite kind of integral to our life experience. So we might kind of think of scenographics going into atmospherics, we might think of these things as kind of oscillating up between each other, or we might think of them as being approximate to one another. And I kind of oscillate between these three different definitions within some of my work, and again, just kind of revisiting that. So this kind of idea coming up to the end of, if scenographics are approximately the same or kind of similar to atmospherics, what is the political task of scenography? So within this is, in Beyond Scenography, I use the double negative in English of the not, where scenography as a crafting is always not a thing. So for instance, if I drew on a mustache onto myself, it would be not a mustache, because you've seen me do the mechanism of production, you understand that it's maybe a bit of lip gloss or something like that, and it's performing the idea of mustache, but it is not a not mustache. It's still actually mustache, but it's just a double negative in that regard. So the double negative becomes a positive. And that, for me, kind of offers you insight into the mechanisms through which world, so the idea of the one world narrative as being not world. It's not world, it's a narrative, it's a process in which we've come to understand it as part of the task of capitalism, but it's also not world, because it's something which, my glasses have kind of caught up in my hair. It's something that we mediate between, but we feel its real effects as part of our daily lives. So as a summary, the idea of practicing world feelings might be one of the political tasks in the future of scenography, particularly in terms of thinking about how it crosses over with atmospherics. And then what matters, what worlds, again, thinking through that middle world of what if scenography is a testing of world as verb. Then really briefly, just at the end, I've done these a few years ago now, YouTube videos if you want to go explore a bit more about the Beyond Scenography concepts. And then lastly, here's the manifesto that features in that book. And I'll just read these out and then I'll finish at the end. So, scenographics irritate the disciplined orders of world. A scenography of orientation is a scenography of feeling. Scenographia has many legacies. Scenography has exceeded the scenographer. Scenography is not set, scenography happens, particular English language. Set actually has one of the most definitions in the English language of any word, so it's an interesting one, that. There are no stages without scenographics. While scenography is scenographic, not all that is scenographic is scenography. Whereas slow architecture pertains to monumentality, fast architecture is scenographic. And then scenographics score acts of worlding. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Rachel. And then we have Ariane Trümper. Thank you, Ariane.
So hello, yes. Also, thank you very much, Rachel. There's a lot I feel I can want to hook on, actually. Very nice to be here. Also very exciting. I'm actually also going to set me a lovely timer, so I know. Yeah, that's my first slide. So I would like to talk today a bit about a methodology of relational staging. And I actually want to think through you, or with you together, a bit through this idea of how could we define the practice, maybe through a methodological approach. Briefly also about who I am. So my name is Ariane Trümper, and I am a course leader of a master program in scenography at the University of the Arts in Utrecht, the HKU. I'm also a member of the research group Expanding Artistic Practices there. And I'm part of other research groups such as Platform Scenography, and I'm actually a maker and an expanded scenographer myself. And of course many other things, but well, let's leave it with that. Briefly, I'm going to use more the discipline of expanded scenography today, and I'm more use this word because it describes, of course, a certain kind of tendency, a certain kind of movement in the practice, but it actually doesn't mean for me that it's excluding other parts of scenography. Oh yeah, I also have this clicker now, so many devices. So, what defines a practice? Or another subtitle I would give this part maybe of my presentation is the lens of a practice and the dissolution of disciplines. I feel there has been already a lot written about scenography and about basically certain characteristics of the expanded practice specifically. But there is still a kind of searching, there's still a search going on. So we're still looking for a kind of way to define it. The characteristics, just to briefly name those for those who maybe are not as familiar with it, are, so, for example, the engagement of senses, so that we are going in a sort of, that we have an idea there's a knowledge in experiencing environment that is different than a knowledge that is written text, for example. There's also very much an expansion happening in the material discourse. So it's about materials, objects, and devices or technologies that actually shape our life. So it's very much about the spaces that actually create the interactions we undergo. And also space is more and more, I think, perceived as a responsive environment. So it's much more a thing that is molded, that comes into existence through various factors. So basically, you could maybe even say that body and minds make spaces, so we are spaces, and spaces are also us. And of course, we're entangled with time, processes, transitions, and transformations, and we very much focus on the spectator. So it's always about creating a certain kind of experience. But what I feel like these characteristics do is that they expand away from a disciplinal understanding of a practice. And what I mean with that is that in the past, I feel disciplines often have been defined by materiality. So for example, I'm a video artist, I make videos, I'm a sound artist, I work with sound, I'm a set designer, I build sets. But I feel that actually this kind of understanding of a practice is not really accurate to what is happening anymore. So I see this with colleagues, I see this also in students, that somehow it doesn't work. I would see this in applications for funds or in all these kind of structures that have been designed to originally help us, that somehow it doesn't fit anymore and you have this feeling of having to bend your practice to actually fit in these structures. So I was wondering, what else could it then be? How else could we maybe define a practice if it's not through the use of materiality? Because there is a difference, there is still a difference. Like if you talk to a fine artist who uses the same materials as you, still it is different actually. So what I'm proposing for that actually is maybe an idea of a methodology. Well, that was actually for now. I forgot to click my buttons, but that's also not that important. And I borrowed a term, Doing Undergoing, by Tim Ingold. And Tim Ingold is an anthropologist who moves basically a lot around in the field of archaeology, art, and architecture. And what I find so interesting about this term is that it, for me, kind of captures practical knowledge. So he talks about this doing and the going, for example, in the context of a walk. So that the walking through a certain terrain does actually give you things which you could not have predicted. So you walk in certain ways, you maybe think of certain things, you meet certain things which make you think and do or walk also in a certain kind of way. And if this concept, of course, we take it serious in a making practice, that also means that the making is something we undergo together in a material or with a space or with people. It means we are co-creating, we're not thinking these things by ourselves, and we also can't think them by ourselves. So it's very much relational, to also use this word. But in the attempt of trying to define this, I do also find certain dilemmas which actually make it difficult. Because if we want to define something, because we want something, we don't want everything because that actually is nothing, so we need to define it somehow, but we also don't want to restrict ourselves. And we specifically don't want to restrict ourselves with frames we actually don't feel fit. The other one is, of course, it's difficult to define something when you want to acknowledge that you're not the only one making the definition. So if you say, I'm co-creating, the outcome is actually a co-creation with, it's actually hard to define it. I wanted to talk a bit about why defining, but I'm going to skip that because of time. But I actually have Rachel's quote from Donna Haraway here too, but we're going to skip it. And I rather want to talk about this idea of a methodology. A methodology is, of course, an artistic research term. It's a research term in general. But what I find appealing about it is that it could be understood as a justification for using certain research tools. So it means it's inherently relational. It already talks about that a process leads to a certain kind of outcome, and also not to a certain kind of outcome. So it defines also a bit what can we use maybe in certain situation to gain which kind of knowledge. And what it also does, because it includes the process and the way of coming somewhere, it does focus on process actually. So if we now think this methodology on scenography, what is it then? What are then the underlying principles of the strategies or the methods we actually use? So what is it we do? Not what is it we are, but what is it we do? And I think many already want to point the discussion to this doing and not the being. And I think maybe methodology does. And here I thought about basically a very, inherent element in the practice is of course the stage itself and the act of staging. And for me, how I want to see stage is that it is sort of an artificial thing. So a stage is there, and artificial actually here, how I want to define it, is it's something that is art. So when we sit in front of a stage, we know this is not reality we're looking at, but it's a staged situation, it's artificial. And the theater itself, as a building, already has this kind of artificially, or this code towards this artificially in it. So we already go in here, we sit here, and we know if we watch a play that this is not reality, but it's a staged event. And I think now with leaving the theater, what we actually do a lot outside of the theater is build this kind of stage. And this building can take in various forms. So it can be a literal building of a stage, like in this example you showed this photo with the landscape in the back. But it can also be a certain kind of different code. So it can be a script, it can be a way of looking on something, it can be a device that makes you look in certain ways. So I think there are various ways of creating a stage, but what it always does, it does abstract somehow the event from the reality. So it makes it in a way artificial. And so that, I think, interestingly, especially in a site-specific context outside of codes, it actually opens up this discussion between reality and fiction. So it really offers this kind of different lens to read something you also experience as real. But then it offers a door to open it up, actually, and to maybe think it differently. So it has a potential to deconstruct the space and to help you maybe to imagine that it could be different. So I feel if we take this as the practice, actually, I think staging in itself is very relational. Because if it works with a pre-existing site, if we accept that doing undergoing is a process that we actually co-create, it leads to this kind of juxtaposition, but it also leads to certain, actually, political terms, and that is something which I realize in education, for example, or in research, is not that easy to define, because there's also a kind of resistance to be too political, too activistic. And actually one of our graduates wrote it in his thesis, which I found quite interesting, that it's not about not being interested actually, but there is a certain feeling of that you can't say the one solution about how it should be different. So there is a certain kind of resistance to be too simple, basically. So you want to be plural. There's a plurality, I think, also inherent, which you actually want to foster. That sometimes makes it also difficult to be, again, concrete or too defined, to narrow it down. So what I feel, if we see scenography as a relational practice, what it wants to foster is a kind of doing undergoing. So it's an experience is something, it's a believing in a bodily knowledge or sensory knowledge, however you want to call this. I think it also wants to foster a polyness, so a plurality of realities. So it doesn't want to unify necessarily, but it wants to show you that there are various ways of looking onto a certain situation. It also states that the sensory perception of the world, and may I have a look at my clock? Oh, yeah, I'm good. Is valuable. So it actually gives me, I think, and especially if you can define it in terms, it of course gives a clear entrance towards this is a way of gaining this kind of knowledge, and it's valuable. And it's hopefully careful with glorifying this kind of human genius. So if we really want to talk about topics like sustainability, climate change, queerness, decolonialism, racism, all these kind of topics that are really buzzing, then I think we have to also be careful with what kind of structures we of course foster. And we have to be plural actually, I think. So I think the practice in itself is very curious about combining sensual, emotional, historical, logic, scientific, so various ways of understanding the world and of communicating. So it's also a multidisciplinary practice in itself. And I would actually, that's why I'm also saying this, is because I see this kind of idea of a relational staging is kind of meta idea, or it's kind of a drive or an orientation. Actually, it was also a nice word I felt related to this. But there are various forms and modes and tools and methods and materials to reach this kind of direction. So I'm actually going to end, I think, with my, I have this is also a little slide actually from Venice during the floodings, and it was a nice contrast with the Biennale. I'm actually curious, what I feel is a thing that really I would like to foster more and discuss more is what is the ethical responsibility? So what are the code of conducts we also want to foster? But because I think we are political very much, and we have ideas about what do we want to foster and what not. And I think the tools itself only partly can do this job. But there is, of course, this dilemma of how do you keep, basically? So how do you keep freedom of the unknown, so the not knowing, the undergoing? So how do you acknowledge that this is a process you have to undergo, you can't define it? But you want to combine this with the desire of being aware of what's going on. So you want to be involved. You don't want to be a secret racist or, I don't know, choose something. So you want to have awareness of your impact, which of course asks about a lot of knowledge beforehand. And you also want to be plural, so you also want to foster complexity. And this is, I see, especially also in research and teaching, but also in the practice itself, it's actually a very tricky thing to balance. And for me, this is one I'm really interested in, actually, in discussing, and where I want to go further with this methodological thinking. So, thank you very much. I'm going to round it up here.
Thank you very much, Ariane. And our last in the row is Alceu Silva Neto. Thank you, Alceu.
Hi, I'm Alceu Silva Neto from Brazil. I'm a researcher in my doctoral program of Brasilia University. And this is not... No surprise anymore. Well, I'm here to talk about scenography and the transcreation. Well, you're kind of heard every day that scenography can be under different names, and sometimes you get confused between them. And the scenography is present in variety of platforms, and the one we can say the visual arts, museums, the ephemeral architecture, the performance, dance, and now we are getting closer to the subject of my thesis and my research, and also that permeates this talk today, that are the movies, TV, and the theater. And I have to talk a little about my thesis because I'm trying to insert a new term, which is the Transcenography. But this term comes from three concepts used since the last century. And the first one is transculturation by Fernando Ortiz, which is a Cuban writer, researcher, and he created this under the Spanish forces of colonization in the Cuban society, doing something parallel between the tobacco and the sugar cane, which is quite interesting. The second one is the transmedia, widely spread by Henry Jenkins. And the last one is the transcreation, the subject of today, was created by a Brazilian, Haroldo de Campos. And the transcreation is initially applied to the field of the literature translation. And so, because of that, we need to make a small parenthesis and rescue Max Benz, who writes about the type of information which can be found during this translation process. And he divides in three different categories, which the first one is the observable or empirical information, which is the documentary information. The second one will be the semantic information, which expanded the observable one, but goes beyond it, but actually cannot be observable by itself, so it needs the first one. And the last one, which is the one that matters for us, is the aesthetic information, is the part of the information responsible for harboring the fascination of the art. And unlike the previous two, it cannot be codified in any other way but the one it was created. So this type of aesthetic information cannot be translatable, so it's untranslatable. And this kind of limitation creates the possibility of the recreation. So it's this type of information we need to take from this talk today, and here I close the parenthesis. And back to Haroldo de Campos, which was a Brazilian poet and translator, and he points out this term, the transcreation, in a response to the fact of moving a work that was composed under a mirror of certain society, a certain geographic location, a certain political position. So we have translation as a displacement. And when this movement is happening, we need to make some changes. So, and has little to do with the barrier language, but more about the new relationship that was created where the historicity of the original text is being appropriated to build something new, parallel, but new now in the present. So the translation, as the movies are suspect of betraying this uniqueness of the work, but it's not a plagiarism. It's the result of a deglutition process. So it's a process that depends on the deconstruction of the original text so that something can be created, something new. And the transcreation is a creative activity that suspends and displaces the dichotomy between fidelity and creative. So when we are moving something to another culture, to another place, or to another political environment, it's very hard to find something with a perfect equivalence. So, especially when we are dealing with something aesthetics or the aesthetic information. So the transcreation is more than just textual, and this is because I use this term to help me to create this base, because the text also has this visual components or the visual syntax of the text, as we say, and this is endorses the discussion. And this visual composition is about the division of the phrases, the alignments of horizontal or vertical alignments, and this kind of layout is, of course, punctual and general linked to the meaning of the text. So there are these semantic and visual correspondence in this work that can be taken care of. So, and this is the same thing we happen in scenography. We have to link the visual, the text, and the experience. I must talk about two kind of broader terms of the transcreation, which is the Umdichtung of Walter Benjamin, which is something about repacking the text, and the creative transposition from Roman Jakobson. But we have another term which is really important to this discussion, that is the adaptation, and that enforces the transcreation and translation idea linked to the scenography. So adaptation is similar to a translation, but happens between different medias or different platforms with and in a new set of conventions and signs. So the adapter needs first to interpret the work, needs to find the essence of the text, and deconstruct the work, and then create in this new system of signs. So this is not literal and a straight process, because changes are always going to happen, and something will be lost, something will be added to it. What scenographers or costume designers, I say Linda Hutchen, are really good examples of possible adapters, because they seek the information in something that was already created, but also seek to understand the needs and the changes that are going to happen to this new production in this new platform or in this new media. So I have some example here, and I've chosen some very commercial examples, and I'd like to take this opportunity to leave a small provocation to the academic environment, which often does not see with good eyes, like receiving pleasure, such a commercial object as a study object. And I'm trying to fight this and say, why not? So we have Beetlejuice. The first example is a piece of costumes. It is the Lydia wedding dress, the first one from the movie, the second one from the musical on Broadway. And we can see here the potential of scenographers or costume designers in the transcreation process, like what is kept and which are the needs of this new production. And so if you look close to both pieces, we have the triangular cutout from the neck, in the use of the transparency and this craft of the tool and the appliques that cover the lap of the actress in both of the examples. And here you have the format of the boots with the waist kind well defined. I mean, they kind look different dresses, but they are not different, but they are not the same. You know, they have the same shape, but it's kind of volumes difference in these. Like we can see here in the shoulders. Both of them, we have this kind of volume, but the first one is just the same fabric, like overlap it, that create these. It's a nice material performance of this kind of cloth. And however, they sleeves the fur. You can see the first one continues this. The dress is almost made in the same fabric and just works with this kind of like one layer or composition of layers. And the first one is like with the transparency of the tool. The second one bets on the overlapping, different fabrics, but they kind have the same idea. The last one are the skirts, although they seem kind different, but they are also kind overlapping fabrics. And the first one is kind of dated model from the 80s, and the second one is more neutral and has a work with some laces on this kind of ruffles, and again the use of different fabrics to create this movement in the in the piece. But the most important thing here in this time is the red color, because in this case the red is kind of shocking. Attention to, they try to shock the spectator, not because the red is not common in the last decades, of course, what was common in brides like centuries ago, but nowadays, like in the last 50 years, it's not a common color. And it's kind of different from the palette of the movie, because we have a lot of purple, we have a lot of green, and the red came to shock and to be different. I mean, she's a teen, like Gary married with a ghost, so it's kind of helped us to give us this idea. The second one is the Moulin Rouge, the movie, and again the Broadway musical. And we can see here the heart shape, which is very present in both of productions. The first one, you can see the frames and like this different scales promoting this kind of movement. And in the second one, that is the musical, the heart, and these frames are the heart, the center of the production. They are in almost every scene, in almost every set. I have one more picture here. And we can see here again the heart framing with this kind of handcraft. But we also have the fabrics and this idea of the luxury room that was created, and the carpets, the drapes, and the velvet. So we can see some similarities, and we can see that they are not the same thing, but they talked, they have something. And again, we have the red. But this red is different because this red is for the love, for the passion, and for the blood. Sorry if anyone hasn't seen the movie, but in Portuguese, the name of the movie is even Moulin Rouge, the love in red. So how important the red is inside this movie, inside this production. Well, for now, regarding the costumes and the set, it's evident the late work were designed based on a reference of the previous one. So we must also consider the difference of the actors and the set changes from the movies to the musical. Because of course we need agility. They need to dance. They need to hide the microphone. So they need to change very fast. So there are some necessities created by this new medium that request such modifications. But it's more than a recoding, like the adaptation. It is creating the new code based on the previous one. So with this, we see the possibility of the application of the concept of the transcreation in scenography, and this opens a small door so we can think about the other applications that this trans prefix in the general field in the scenography. Thank you.
Thank you, Alceu. So I'm gonna now invite our speakers on the stage. We're gonna situate ourselves. Yes, orient ourselves. Wow, thank you for wonderful presentations. I enjoyed all of them. It's really great to see different examples of practices, but also different ways of different knowledges, really different ways of thinking about scenography, which is already, I think, enacting the pluriverse, at least for me. But there were some points of connection, which was wonderful to see. So not to put any pressure on my speakers, but would any of you like to respond or react to any other presentation first before we open it to the audiences?
Yeah, I mean, only really to say, yeah, a wonderful collection, I think, of different ideas. I think actually particularly that last presentation there, thinking about the idea of trans scenography, particularly without a gap. that it's all one word, where it's really deriving from that idea of translation, of moving between one form, one media, or one act of mediating to another act of mediating. And I think you did a really nice job of plotting those interconnections. But also, I think there's kind of the element of, I couldn't not think about branding when I saw that, because obviously the examples that you gave, and I also use a lot of examples from popular culture, and a lot of the time in those instances, particularly where they're in a sequence of medias, so, you know, the universes of Marvel and DC and things like this, where there are acts of translation, of connecting the dots. I also, for my sins, I watch all the Star Treks of various different forms and how they've translated different ideas. So that I can definitely see, for instance, an act of Transcenography occurring within the different adaptations of Star Trek, and how they've kind of, when they've kind of done the examples of going the series that are before the Captain Kirk ones in the 1960s, but still trying to make it believable in terms of it being high-tech, but still not kind of dismissing the sorts of high-tech ideas they had in the 1960s. So yeah, I just wanted to kind of mention that, but also about the idea of branding, particularly with the Moulin Rouge thing. I kind of saw a lot of branding going on. But yeah, that's a separate thing.
Thank you, Rachel. Okay. All right, all right. Our speakers need a little second. No. So do we have any questions from the audiences?
I think it's quite early in the morning. I think.
Yeah, I know.
Still
and we
waking
started
up.
with some heavy critical frames and theories. So can we maybe go back? Oh, sorry. Yes, let's do that.
Hi there. I was really excited to hear many of you sort of gesture towards this idea of plurality and there being like multiple realities. Do any of you have any kind of interest or intersection with the idea of metamodernism in the work you're doing?
Can you say that again, that last?
Yeah, I've just been researching through my past thesis metamodernism, and this also really delves into this idea of multiple realities and sort of there being no fixed truth or no fixed one way. And I, you know, to that point of plurality, I was really excited by that. So I'm just interested if there's any intersections with that sort of concept of metamodernism in your way of thinking.
Metamodernism, yeah.
I don't know the concept. Maybe you can explain just I don't know it.
Oh yeah, it's sort of like an umbrella academic term that sort of encompasses this idea of moving past there being one sort of true fixed way. You know, I think in arts and certainly in theater, we have conversations about truth and how we transmit truth to other people. I always kind of think that's bullshit. Sorry for, you know, that there isn't really truth, that the audience is sort of enacting that process for themselves. So this idea of plurality just really excited me. I don't know if any of you wanted to elaborate on that.
Yeah, I'm happy to. For me, it's more about an understanding of ourselves in the world, actually. So, and I think there is this modern story of, for example, the hero of the one human who is the one who saves the world, or I don't know. There's a certain kind of narrative, I think, that has been told, which is the Anthropocene maybe as well, that we are something better, we are above, there's all these hierarchies and structures and images we have related to that. And I think currently there is, of course, a wish to define us differently, to be entangled in a mesh, to be part of something that constructs something bigger. And I think an aspect of this is that you actually realize there is not just one narrative, but there are several ones. There are several positions you could have. There are several ways of looking onto things. So that's where I would actually see this plurality coming in, because there's a certain desire of also acknowledging, yeah, okay, I have this story, but others have this story, other entities have these stories. So for me, it actually talks about a kind of need, about a search of, in general, a search of us actually to understand us differently, and then also look onto how do we then tell these stories differently. So what is the narrative then of these stories, and how do they have to be constructed and told?
Yeah, I mean, and particularly in terms of the metamodernism. I've definitely considered it within my own work. I mean, I did my PhD on modernism, where the idea of the future was effectively a manifestation of form, and you just needed to find the right form to kind of realize the kind of possibilities of expression and human thriving. But I also am quite critical of ideas of modernity. And particularly about the ways in which modernity is often bound and tied to an act of coloniality in some form, but also the idea of progression, and about the narrative of progression, and the future will be better, and it will be made better through a kind of centrality of the human genius. The idea of human technology will be our savior. So this idea of the technological savior is often a narrative in modernity that will provide future thriving and allow our future generations, and this kind of privileging of the child in that regard in terms of the future and thinking about what future generations, what their lives will be like. I do think that in a moment of ecological breakdown, that narrative of modernity I think can be usefully challenged, and particularly the idea of progression and regression, because that's the shadow of progression, is the idea of regression. And certainly with Arturo Escobar's idea of the pluriverse, and particularly of the idea of possible, and what is possible, challenging that colonial modernity matrix that the future is only more technology and therefore only more capitalism and therefore only more corporations owning our lives and controlling the ways in which we are able to express. Modernity in that regard is linked to that narrative. So I don't use metamodernism for that purpose, but I agree with the definition that you gave, so that sounds good.
If I may add one little thing to that, I also really appreciate the ideas of plurality and being heterogeneous. I do think it's worth mentioning too that I think it was on your slide, Rachel, mentioning Arturo Escobar and the idea of the world where many worlds fit actually come from the indigenous autonomous communities in Mexico. So it's a Maya idea, it's an indigenous idea that challenges, like Rachel was saying, the colonial thinking and the colonial project, but it's all this talk about plurality, I think, is about us situating us where we are and from where we speak. I'm not sure that the project of modernity does that, right? And I feel like that's really important for us right now, I would say. Yeah, so just to acknowledge that, the Maya knowledge that feeds us now in the discussion. Do we have any more questions or comments?
Hi. Hello. Hi. I love the idea of challenging the colonial West concepts and all those things that you were just saying. That movement is very important. And I'm curious how the audience is affected. Sometimes when we learn about this stuff, we have to think about the audience experience. And I love the plurality of experiences that an audience would have in any of these scenarios presented. So I'm wondering what the challenges are within this sort of movement and with what y'all are saying within the audience experience. Or successes, challenges or wins.
I mean, I think in certain ways it's similar to a set or a stage piece, but what is of course different, what I think is you have to set a code yourself. So in a theater space, there is already a sort of communal agreement. You already know what you're getting into, and that is of course not the case if you now go in the topic of expanded. That's now of course the thing I more talk about. Often you actually have to set this code. And that is not easy because you don't know exactly who's going to watch. There is a variety of people who's going to watch. But this, for me, this is actually the dilemma. It's actually hinting for me towards also this, what is the thing that is very sensitive to figure out, basically. You also don't want to trigger anybody, or you don't want to raise any bad experience. So I think on the one side, it's really rehearsing, it's experimenting with it, it's trying it out in certain frames where you can do that safely. but it's also really learning what those codes are and how it functions. And then, of course, it shifts again concerning where you move. So, I mean, it's also something, there's so many pieces who move around internationally, and they all talk about how different it is perceived in different countries and cultures. So, I don't know if there's really one simple solution about it besides being curious about it, cautious about it, and thinking along, basically. And also not, I think that there will always be mistakes happening, but you should be aware of that and also, take that into account. That's, from out of practice, what I feel is maybe the only way of how you can deal with it, if you don't want to stagnate completely, basically.
Yeah, I think I would also add that particularly actually, so Arturo Escobar does not write about theatre, does not write really about art in that regard, but really writes about civilization change and how we might prepare for multiple possibles of what future forms of civilization in their kind of contexts might be like and might feel like, and how we might be better prepared for those feelings and be better prepared for those possibilities that come with that. And I think for me, I kind of subscribe to the idea that artworks and mediated forms in general kind of add up to a weak gesture. A number of weak gestures that build a wave, and then over time, and we are talking about time in this regard, kind of relatively long generations, over time, the idea of that possible becomes the crescendo. The idea of actually this is the civilization we're going towards. So people are prepared for it rather than it surprising you like Brexit. I'm British. So, it doesn't necessarily work like that. It's not necessarily in a revolutionary form, but more in a series of weak gestures rather than strong gestures that add up to the idea of the possible. But of course, sometimes urgency, sometimes the idea of urgency is obviously there in necessitation. So when our water supplies are kind of, when we have the potential water wars in the future, where clean and non-seawater forms are kind of more rare, that will have an urgency to it, but being prepared for those multiple possibles. In the same way that actually the 20th century has prepared us through mediation for the idea of space travel in a way in which is just added up over time, and now it seems highly possible that we can go colonize the universe in spaceships rather than actually thriving in the ecological environment that's the only ecological environment that we know how to thrive. What's possible? Yeah.
In the transcreation idea, when you're dealing with the spectator, it's kind of hard because you are dealing with some kind of affection in the regular way, not in the academic way, because there are a lot of expectations. So you are dealing with feelings of the more than the normal and the original one. So you're dealing with a base of people that know the first one, and they expected that to be their vision. Because when you take a book and transform it into a play, or when you take a movie and transform, of course, it's going to be changes, limitations, and like the needs I talked about. But so it's kind of a political relationship between the creators, the artists, and of course, you cannot please everyone, but you try to stick to your vision and not disappoint the fan base or something that was waiting for something to be identical like their thing was in their mind. So.
But also responding, I think there's also this interesting point of including this as one play is also a process of a bigger development. So also this that you see yourself more as a wave of a lot of people, so that in a way, it's actually, I think, taking yourself a little less serious sometimes, and one thing you present also, because it's a part of a bigger thing you maybe develop, you also learn constantly, and you also contribute to a wider discourse. So I think also there, again, we have a narrative. I'm not sure if we want to actually play this one, that we always have to make everything so important that the one play now changes the world. It won't, very likely, but it maybe can contribute to something that will at some point help changing something. So also in there, like in this question, actually, I feel there's also something to think about. Is this now really, do we not have a bit more freedom to discuss, because it's actually not going to change the world probably, but it maybe can contribute, help others to think, and then through that actually have an impact. I mean, we discussed about this word also recently, but I think there's also a structure to question actually.
Well, I think if people think something's so precious because they have to see what the movie was or what was in their mind when they read the book, but they're willing to let go of that. They buy the ticket, they do the thing, they allow themselves to let go of that expectation, then I think that kind of keeps the doors open for these other future things, even outside of the play, these other concepts and things that are going to happen within the environment ecologically. So I think it's like the little teeny moves that could happen that you're talking about.
Yeah, and I mean, it can also lead to that you don't see a performance so much as a product, maybe, but that you see it as a development of a practice, basically, that is happening in a communication. And also because the way of how theater is produced is really a production. I mean, a lot of you saw Tanja Baer, for example, who makes this nice reformulation of this production cycle. And there is, of course, something. We are caught in this kind of cycle, and that leads to a certain kind of structure we maybe actually don't like, or that feeds maybe things we actually don't want to support.
Just an example for me. For the vigil, a participatory choreography by Joan Letton, there is a preparation for the audience to do this act of seeing sunset or sunrise. So there is a rehearsal to have standing. A presence before the landscape, and it's about preparation for the audience to accept this particular, this singular experience of meditative show. I'm sorry for my English.
Thank you for that. There is a question up there, and then, oh, sorry. Renato, okay. Hi.
Hello, good morning. I would like to post a reflection and also a kind of provocation. So I'm deeply interested to think this expanded perspective of scenography and all of these stuffs from the global south perspectives, because I think in terms of colonialism, and political, economical, and also this process of destructive is very different in this part of the world than the other part of the world. And I'm also reflecting and asking myself if it would be possible to think about this more than human perspective or nature perspective without a real connection with this. Or if you are just changing our object or stuff that we are just putting in the stage, or if you are always like just looking this in an outside perspective. Could it be like beyond the human perspective without a real connection?
Yeah, Renato, I think that, it's beautiful in some respects, but also incredibly challenging. Because I do think the idea of the human holds us back. And I mean that in so much that really for the last 200 years, the kind of philosophical projects of the West, which I would then connect to Enlightenment, I would also connect to modernity, have privileged and I'm not necessarily saying that human is not special, I'm just saying there are many forms of special, and that the idea of only privileging a certain form of special, and actually I'll give the example of going up into space, that often the going up into space is to dislocate ourselves from nature, again, this idea of human as distinct from nature, and that we only take nature because we need to feed ourselves. Not this idea that actually this idea of human is utterly a symbiotic relationship with the ecologies of processes of other life forms and other processes that have allowed us. And I always give the example of there is more bacterial DNA in my body than there is human DNA. And all the things that I describe as being great about human, of running, of eating, of partying, all of those things are only possible because of the symbiotic relationship I have with these DNA that allow me to process the energy that I get from my gut into my body. So that kind of symbiotic relationship, the thing I call human, is really dependent upon these bacteria that often we don't have an imagination of. And it's that challenge, that crisis of imagination, and how do we make weak gestures to allow us to think otherwise? But for me, it's a thinking otherwise in terms of what a future is and what the future possibles might be. But I'm really excited, and I would like to talk more to you about that, because particularly from the Global South, that would be fantastic.
Yeah, hesitant. Well, I'm not exactly sure if I'm answering what you asked, but I do feel there is also this question of, can we tell a story that is not human, basically? And I think one problem in there is that we can't never get out of being humans in a way. But I think we can define differently what we understand about that. Like, I think we have an objective way of looking at the word, and you can't get out of your head and out of your body. So I think that's the problematic about it. But I think there's very much, we should much more try to see us differently in relating to everything else around us, and through that also give the floor to try to give the floor to others at least, as much as we can.
We have a question.
Hi everyone. Good morning to everybody. I'm going to try to be articulate about my question. This is for Rachel, but I think it can apply to everybody. The theme of this morning is repositioning scenography. So each of your takes is about something challenging, something already positioned, or already in place. I would be interested in knowing, when you speak about your take to people maybe more in the doxa side, and is there a doxa about scenography? About what is scenography, what it should do, what it should say. How does it go? Is there some big challenges, or does it fit really well? What is there a debate? Where is the challenge?
There was one word I didn't quite catch, which is the main word. You said doxa?
Yeah. Doxa, it's a position, strong position about what something is.
Oh, okay. Okay. A general. Okay. So when I'm talking more generally about what is scenography.
Yes, your take on scenographics. This is the first time I hear these words and these takes, and I'm really, really interested about it. It's really interesting, and it resonates with my own work. So maybe it challenges what people think usually about what scenography is and what it does.
Yeah, so thank you for that question. I think my main thing is that partly the project of Beyond Scenography came out of that question of there are lots of different, often continental European languages that have adopted different translations of scenographer from the Greek, and often they were similar but different. And this is what a lot of the PQ conversations over the last kind of 30 years have been about. In my language and in my country, scenography means this, and in particular, the English language adoption with scenography, with a Y, took quite an expanded idea of scenography. I mean, think about expanded, which I actually phrase as there was two stages of expansion. One is the adoption of scenography, primarily I argue from the Czech understanding of scenography, where it includes the lighting, the sound, the costume as well within that to a certain degree, although actually certain scholars never really spoke about a costume at that time period. They excluded it. I've got other opinions about why they excluded costume, but that's separate. And that kind of idea of it being all together, that wasn't the case for many other continental European languages. So I kind of was very interested about how we might recognize scenography as a particular kind of crafting in the tradition of that first expansion, and then looking at scenographics as really a way of helping us describe the things that may not actually be scenography, but materialize and are experienced as if they are scenography. So I talk a lot about gardening. And the way in which gardening is a scenographic act, but it could be described as a scenography, but the people who are doing it wouldn't describe themselves as scenographers, but I could call them scenographers. So it's more about the kind of categories of difference in language, but then also removing that from the actual experience itself. So scenographics looking to privilege the processes and the techniques of scenographic practices without necessarily binding it to scenography as a particular craft or definition in that language, but recognizing the tensions there. I hope that helps.
Yes.
Thank you, Rachel. I know we had more questions, but unfortunately we're out of time. So I'm gonna have to thank our wonderful audiences for staying with us through discussing theory. And above all, thank you to our wonderful speakers. Thank you again for your presentations.